Ethical Challenges to Researching Youth Cultures in Historical Web Archives. I'm Katie McKinnon, a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Information, and I'm excited to share this paper that works through some of the ethical challenges I've come across in my research. My doctoral research is on the experiences of young people learning about and exploring the World Wide Web from Canadian homes, schools, libraries, and community centers between 1994 and 2004. My research includes federal policy interventions, public discourse in Canadian media, and oral interviews, but I engage significantly with web archives in order to provide perspectives from young and marginalized people who are creating websites and community on the early web. My research is focused on GeoCities, one of the most popular web hosting platforms between 1996 and 1999. GeoCities users, called homesteaders, could build websites for free in different neighborhoods that reflected interests and hobbies, like West Hollywood for LGBTQ+, or Enchanted Forest for youth. When the platform was removed from the web in 2009, there were significant archival efforts to preserve the once thriving online community in the Internet Archive. For researchers, this archive poses significant ethical, methodological, and epistemological issues. While it is an incredible resource for researching a history of online communities on the early web, it also creates opportunities for harmful data practices while also calling into question individuals' rights to be forgotten. How do we ethically engage with archived web materials that young people created over 20 years ago without their knowledge or consent? Debates over best practices of internet research ethics have been ongoing for the past 2 decades among scholars from a variety of fields, with numerous professional organizations developing guidelines. For instance, the Association of Internet Researchers, the Norwegian National Committee for Research Ethics in Social Sciences and Humanities, and the Satori Ethics Assessment in Internet Research Ethics. Ethics protocols in general are modeled after human rights and protection principles that emerged from medical science and were consolidated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the Nuremberg Code in 1949, and the Belmont Report in 1979. The focus is typically on minimizing harm and maximizing benefits, with overall principles of respect and justice, resulting in general research practices around informed consent, confidentiality, privacy, and anonymity. Digital research has renewed debates over implications of these concepts because the concept of harm can be difficult to operationalize in a socio-technical context in a way that is persistent, replicable, scalable, and searchable. It is generally agreed upon by internet researchers that there should be no fixed rules for ethically sound research with digital media because it's impossible to establish protocols that can be applied across all contexts, cultures, and research fields. Instead, a case-by-case approach that allows for similar questioning and reflection around procedure, tools, collection, storage, processing, and documentation has been encouraged. Since ordinary individuals and their public activities, as well as their personal lives, are less well represented in historical records before the age of the internet, web archives hold the potential to shift the types of history that can be written, where terabytes of information are collected, stored, and preserved from lay people and sources so that history can be written from below. This opens up radical potentials for history on the margins of society, giving voice and power to communities and subcultures typically absent or erased from the records. However, this potential creates a pressing need for stronger, more robust ethical frameworks, guidelines, and protocols to ensure that histories of the early web do not deploy systems of data exploitation or oppression. It's imperative for me to consider whose stories are being told, who's equipped to tell them, and what kinds of vulnerabilities and harms I might encounter and create when doing so. If we consider how throughout the past 15 years, young people's data have been subject to commodification, surveillance, and archiving without consent, researchers who engage with archived web material have a responsibility to develop better practices of care for web materials created by young people in the past. I'm going to provide an overview demonstrating the trajectory of web ethics discussions and debates that I've explored in my approach to web archival research and point to sensitizing concepts applicable to develop an ethics of care. While defining the contours of historical web research ethics and bringing together pieces in conversation with each other, I also hope to demonstrate some of the gaps and oversights that are later addressed in some of what I've found in critical feminist scholarship. Holly Crossan-White describes this as a new era in historical research, where the use of technology to explore the lives of individuals from the past in greater detail is really part of an ongoing wider global debate on the use of technology. For example, in 2014, the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that in accordance with the EU's 1995 Data Protection Directive, individuals have the right to be forgotten in online search engines like Google. This language was seen again in the EU's General Data Protection Regulation in 2016, which applied the right to erasure to prevent the indefinite storage and trade in electronic data, placing limits on duration and purpose of the data. It also states that individuals may request the data be deleted should it become irrelevant, inaccurate, or cause harm that is not outweighed by a public benefit in retaining the data. This directive has become relevant to internet researchers for many reasons, but particularly applies to my use of web archives for historical research. In 2002, a working group created the Association of Internet Researchers Ethical Guidelines, which have been since updated in 2012 and 2020. The guiding principles declare that researchers must weigh harms to research communities, balance the right of subjects with the social benefit of the research, and consider the possibility of increasing the vulnerability of the researched communities. Concepts explored in the guidelines include informed consent, method of accessing data, analysis, potential findings that can create harms, context and social vulnerability, which responds to many of the gaps from previous ethical standards adopted by universities and research communities. Taking up the AOIR guidelines and exploring ethical issues associated with providing access to web archives, Jimmy Lin and his team surveyed different ethical frameworks that scholars and system builders have been engaging with to discuss the types of analysis that can and should be conducted. They grapple with the notion that while researchers have the computational tools to scrape web data for many types of analysis, a more pertinent question is whether it is ethical to pursue these types of academic avenues of inquiry. They focus on content-based retrieval, large-scale distant reading, and user re-identification for research engaged with digital history. They determined two significant guiding principles for developing better practices of care: context, which is what the original creators expected of their materials, and scale, the distance between the researcher and the content creator. Stein-Lomborg also references these concepts and asks, how can we ensure that the voluntary sharing of personal data at one point in time does not come to negatively impact the research subject at a later point in time? Especially when researching children, social or politically marginalized groups, and physically or mentally vulnerable individuals entails a great ethical responsibility to protect participants from being bullied or put on undesirable public display, regardless of whether their online activities we study revolve around their vulnerability. These questions highlight some of the most prominent concerns with the use of web archives for my research on youth cultures online, and reflects some of the issues with archives like the Internet Archive. In proposing an answer to these questions, Lomborg highlights Helen Niesenbaum's contextual integrity, an expectations-based framework for ethical reasoning about privacy and the protection of human subjects from harm in digital contexts. Instead of thinking of privacy as a matter of universal principles about who should have access to what information in which contexts, Niesenbaum suggests a lens of privacy as contextual integrity to consider whether something must be treated as private or not by looking at the specific context, data, and actors involved. The principle of contextual integrity invites researchers to dwell on the possible ethical consequences of repurposing historical web data from the original context to the archive and onto the context of web history. In this framework, the relationship between actors, content, and context are bound together, and also invoke the distance principle, which measures the distance between the object of study and the person who produced it. Katrin Tindenberg explores how the applications of digital research ethics, such as seeking informed consent and manipulating data for confidentiality, privacy, and anonymity, is an ongoing issue in digital saturated contexts. They explain that since sharing has become a default relationship between the self and technological infrastructures, which is both manipulated by the infrastructure to create and collect more valuable data, but also the very nature of digital communication, a lack of privacy has been normalized. Privacy is instead constituted as an individual burden, where individuals are responsible for modulating their platform settings in relation to their awareness of privacy needs, which removes responsibility away from corporations and platforms as well as researchers. With these sensitizing concepts in mind, I still seek further exploration on practices of care. How should researchers approach sensitive web materials from 20 years ago? I turn to critical feminist frameworks to explore some of these questions. In the AOIR 3.0 guidelines, Aline Franska presents an overview of feminist ethics of care to demonstrate how the intersections of power relationships produce inequalities that are relevant in the study of internet ethics. Some key principles highlighted call for the assessment of relationships between the researchers, the researched, and the wider research community. These guidelines are integral to the development of ethical commitments in research practices. However, their application to specific research contexts is not yet widely accepted. Cohen Lurs, in his research with digital practices of young Londoners, created a roadmap to alternative data analysis practices that explores what a social justice-oriented feminist data study could look like. His framework allows for attention to human making, context specificity, interdependencies, temptations, as well as benefits and harm, with a moral focus on relationality, responsibility, intersubjectivity, and the autonomy of the research participants. Lurs' roadmap highlights 5 statements about data-related research practices, asserting that people are more than their digital data because data are limited, ahistorical, and decontextualized. Data is context-specific and performative. Data is dependent and relational to the platform it was created on. We are tempted to overinvest in digital representations of people, and we benefit in various ways from our studies that do not always benefit research participants. Lurs' roadmap demonstrates one of the most robust approaches available and was paired with qualitative interviews with the young people whose data he was engaging with. My approach to studying digital practices of Canadian youth 20 years ago borrows from this roadmap, but there are additional challenges to researching older web materials. In the same vein as Lurs, the Feminist Data Manifesto, a project led by Marika Siffer and Patricia Garcia and supported by numerous techno-feminist scholars, pulls at the intricacies of data-based research practices and suggests new pathways to considering our ethical responsibility to human-centric web data. It declares that data is always and variously attached to bodies and vows to interrogate the biopolitical implications of data with a keen eye to gender, race, sexuality, class, disability, nationality, and other forms of embodied difference. Data feminism echoes these sentiments, calling for changes to oppressive data collection, storage, and manipulation tactics in academic research. They reaffirm that, despite the apparent ubiquity and novelty of data harvesting, the act of collecting and recording data about people is not new at all. In fact, it has long been employed as a technique of power and control over the lives of people whose data are collected. The relationship between data and power is clear historically, whether it's the logs of people captured and sold into slavery or the biometric technologies that are deployed to surveil Black people. With this in mind, the question of data ethics requires a framework of data justice rather than ethics alone, where inequalities of the past and research and archive practices are not replicated into the future. One of my main challenges to researching historical web archives is grappling with the distance between researchers and the researched. Websites become defunct, users have grown up and changed names, and communities have splintered and dispersed. While deploying contextual integrity tactics and evaluating the scale of archived web materials are significant ethical developments, getting in contact with those whose data was stored in archives is still an important ethical dimension for many internet researchers. Recent scholarship on growing up online has rejected or interrogated the archive as a site of study because of its inherently exploitative relationship with online communities. Casadera has written about the ethical difficulties in researching and writing about queer and trans young people online in the 2000s in their own doctoral research. In their article, Delete Your Account, they write that while archives of queer and trans life and survival are scarce and therefore valuable, there's a significant anti-archival trans politics that have emerged not out of desire for self-annihilation, but out of resistance to being siphoned up, pinned down by state or corporate collection. As I begin the collection phase of my doctoral research, this means critically assessing my use of web archives and building from feminist frameworks for engaging with these materials, while developing an ethics of care that can be applied to studying online communities in the past. Thank you so much for listening.